Hi, my name is Daniel Jedediah Cook, and I want to talk this a little bit about the breath of creation. Now, I've spoken earlier about Aleph, and Aleph being the breath of Almighty Yahweh, and I want to add to that. I want to start by first reading a very, very familiar scripture in Genesis 1, verses 1 through 3. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God there is the living letter, the Hebrew word ruach. And we'll talk about ruach at a later time, but for now, I want to deal specifically with the living letters, and especially Aleph and Hey when it comes to this. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, previously when I talked about Aleph, I talked about the Aleph being the very breath that we take. And it's in the moment that we decide and choose to engage our vocal cords, and we choose to begin to speak, that a vibration, a frequency occurs, and we will begin to be able to form our breath. But every breath begins with Aleph and is the fullness of Aleph, because it is the very fullness of Almighty Yahweh himself. And the scripture, I'm reminded of that scripture that I spoke about earlier, where it talked about all that has breath praises the Lord. And if we think about that, every time we take a breath, we're indeed saying the word of the living letter Aleph. And we are indeed engaging that Spirit of Almighty Yahweh, regardless of the words formed. Regardless of the words formed. And so, there's an idea behind creation in every breath that is taken. And in particular, I want to bring in the living letter Hey, because Hey talks about breath, but it's slightly different in the sense of what we're talking about when we talk about Aleph. Because see, Hey is what I like to call the formed breath. Because what Hey does is frames a creation. It frames something. So just like what I was talking about just a moment ago when I was referring to Aleph being the breath itself, and the moment that we engage our vocal cords, sound comes out and words are formed as a result of that. Hey is a representation of those formed words. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. He spoke into existence. But see, that existence and that creation that he began to speak was, he began to walk through all 7 days of 6 days of creation and the seventh day of rest. And of course, the eighth day, if you can go there, will be added into that as well. But every part that he began to speak, he formed the creation with the sound of his voice. His breath came out. The Spirit of Almighty Yahweh came out in the spirit of Aleph, but it was formed through the living letter Hey. And you see, because if you look at the living letter Hey, I want to show you some things that I found very, very interesting when I look at the living letter Hey. Because the living letter Hey is actually formed from a dalet and a yod. We can see the dalet here. Dalet refers to door, or portal, if you will. And then yod is, I like to refer to it as the allspark of creation, because yod is that place. It's of the beginning, if you will. It's the dot. It's the tiny little dot. It's that place where Yahweh spoke his creation into existence and put his light into the vastness of who he was, and that light formed the creation that we now see. But when we're talking about in the sense of breath, there is a portal and a door. And Yahweh made us to be portals and doors. Just as Yeshua was in the earth, so are we. And Yeshua was that door that brought us back to that communion again with the Father. And I always find it kind of interesting here where Beit, if you can look real closely, is hidden right here inside of Aleph. So even Aleph references the place of communion, that place of intimacy, that place with just Yahweh and I in the midst of all that, and that place where, if you will, of our heart, because we know that the throne of Almighty Yahweh has been placed and set in our hearts. But let me continue on with Hey, because the door of the words that are spoken, the door of the words that when Yahweh spoke into creation, set into existence the very creation that we see. But one thing that Yahweh always showed me when I first began to learn about the living letters was not only how they reflected him and who he was, because in the living letters, I began to see a greater fullness and a more depth into who he was. And the more I saw, the more in awe I became, because there was just so much depth to who he was. But what he also showed me was not only that it reflected him, but also that it reflected me. And I began to see myself in the midst of the living letters as well as I was him. And so if I begin to look at these two letters, then these two living letters, particularly in dealing with the breath of creation, the very breath that I breathe, all that has breath praises the Lord. The very breath that I breathe is in honor to Almighty Yahweh. But there's a door, a place of choice. One of the ways that I've always seen Dalet is a place of choice. And I'm reminded of the story of Abraham, where he stood at his doorway as he saw the two men walking up. This was before the time of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah. But he stood at the doorway and he ran out to greet the men and brought the men back into the house. And that's where they communed and talked. And Abraham had the opportunity to begin and if you will, barter with God with regards to that, because he cried out and said, well, if we find 50 righteous men, if we find 10 righteous men, and so on. So you've got the Dalet I've always seen as a place of choice. The Yod there is, again, that place of creation and speaking into existence those things of creation. So Hey begins to frame our world. You know, I think I spoke about this before, and because I was referring to another aspect of all of this, but there's a meme that I found on the internet not too terribly long ago that really speaks to me when it comes to this, and that is, I am are two of the most powerful words that we can say, because what we say after them forms our reality. And Hey is a perfect picture of that meme, truth be told. Because, again, as we begin to engage our voice, engage our words, engage what we're speaking, then our words will form the reality that we are indeed seeing. You see, all of this fits together in another Hebraic concept. And that Hebraic concept is known as tikkun olam. Or in the literal sense, it references the repair of the world. And this is part of the meat of what I wanted to get to here today with talking about this, because we've got the Aleph, the breath. We've got the Hey. The Hey is, again, the framing. But more specifically, it's framing with intent. There's an intention behind it. Just as the door was the place of choice for Abram, and Abraham in this case, so is the door the place of choice for us. And the words that we speak become that breath of creation in what Yahweh has given us. You know, my word goes forth into all the earth, and it will not return back to me void, Yahweh says. It will accomplish all that I have set out to it. And in our agreement with those words, and as we begin to speak, we begin to form the creation of who we are. But tikkun olam, let's get back to tikkun olam. Tikkun olam refers to the repair of the world. And one of the ideas behind the concept of tikkun olam isn't quite what you might think it might be, because when we start thinking about repair of the world, we think about what can we do to be able to make things different? What can we do? What can we say? How can we change something? But the truth is tikkun olam actually takes that and points it back to us, because Tikkun Olam and the concept behind Tikkun Olam talks about, if I want to change the world, then the first place that I need to change the world is right here first. This is the place where I change the world. So I begin to see in these two living letters the responsibility, the breath that Yahweh has already given me, and the breath that every breath that I take is in praise to Almighty Yahweh. But he's given me an honor, a responsibility to be able to speak, to co-create with him. You know, I'm reminded of Revelation where it talks about the Spirit and the bride say, come. And this is what we're talking about here. And when we're referencing the living letter Hey here, because again, it's the framing, it's the breath with intent. It's the formed intent of the word that we're speaking. So I look at Luke 6:45, and let me read Luke 6:45 real quickly. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth that which is good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth that which is evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And this is the place where we're coming to. And because my heart is crying out to see the difference. And I know some of you may say, well, Daniel, I hear what you're saying, because we're talking about seeing the things that we have declared, seeing the things that Yahweh has spoken about us, seeing those things that He's promised us, and we're not always seeing the full fruition of what we've seen, and maybe even what we've declared. And part of that has to do with this, because yesterday I was meditating, and Yahweh spoke this to me specifically. He said, in this place of now, in this place of being in him, if you can see it, we are already standing in a place where all is already complete. All needs are met. All dreams are fulfilled. We are indeed sons who stand in the fullness of the measure of the stature of Christ. But again, I want to see more of that. I'm crying out because my spirit man is crying out. I want to see more of who you are. I want to know more of who you are. And yes, this is indeed part of the process. But let's begin, as we're talking about this, the Spirit and the bride say, come, realizing that our words have a part to play in how this is all brought about. In this place of now, that I have the responsibility to not only to have his breath, but to form the words that he's speaking. I have the responsibility to create the very things that he's showing me in my spirit and in my heart. The very breath of Almighty Yahweh. Thank you very much. You guys have a great day.